Today we're going to look at primaries and caucuses and the role in a presidential election. Now, lots of times when we think of elections, we think of the general election. And the election that we consider the general election, excuse me, right here, is when there'll be typically two candidates who have a chance of winning, a Republican and a Democratic candidate. So they run against each other, and whoever wins that political office. That's a general election. But really, an election that is important that happens previous to that is called a primary election, or sometimes we refer to these as caucuses too, or there's primaries and caucuses are similar. Okay, and let me explain something first. Let's take a look at this. Let's say that we have 3 Democrats. We'll say candidate A, candidate B, and candidate C. And let's say they're all running against one candidate on the Republican side. And let's say that's candidate B. Now, if we have 3 Democrats running against one Republican, there's a very good chance that Republican is going to win because these Democrats will split the vote. Let me explain. Let's say that there's a total of 100 votes, and let's say 60 of them are going to vote for a Democratic candidate, and 40 are going to vote for a Republican candidate, or the Republican candidate. Well, since there's only one Republican candidate, this candidate gets all 40 of the votes. But let's say over here, candidate A gets 30, candidate B gets 20, and candidate C gets 10. Those 60 votes were split up among these 3 candidates, which means that candidate B wins the election because he got the most votes. If a particular party has multiple candidates running, they're most likely going to split their votes and cost them a chance of winning the election. Okay? Now, using that, understanding that concept, let's look at the importance of primary election. What a primary election does is when the party chooses the candidate that's going to run against the other party's candidate in the general election. Okay? And if we look at a primary is that election where that political party decides which candidate they will support. They might have 3 good candidates, but they only want to pick one, so they got to figure out a way to choose the best candidate. There are 2 types of primaries. There's a closed primary and an open primary. Actually, there's more than just these 2, but there's these 2 that we're going to talk about, the 2 most common types. A closed primary is closed to everybody except for that particular party. So a Democratic closed primary would be closed to everybody except for Democrats. Makes sense that the Democrats would choose their candidate. An open primary is open to all political parties. There's not a lot of open primaries out there. Most of them are closed. So the Republicans in South Dakota will hold a closed primary in South Dakota. The Democrats in South Dakota will hold a closed Democratic primary. And then they'll choose their candidates. Now, if it's just like a congressional election, there's only one primary. But if it's a presidential election, there needs to be a primary or a caucus in every single state. Now, what is a caucus? Well, a caucus is very similar to a primary. They basically accomplish the same thing. They just go about it through a different manner. A primary election is you actually go in and you cast your vote, and then you're done. You go to the voting booth, you cast your vote, you walk out. A caucus is a meeting. So party members from the state will meet in different locations, and they'll have a meeting, and then they'll divide up among the room. At least this is how it happens in some caucuses. So let's say they're meeting in an auditorium. Everybody in favor of candidate A goes to one side of the auditorium, candidate B goes to another location, candidate C another location, and you literally count up how many people are in location. Okay. Basically what I need you to know is a primary and caucus accomplishes the same thing. They determine who the state necessarily represents. Now this is an example, this is the calendar of the 2012 Republican primary schedule. You notice that Iowa was the first one, and actually Iowa was a caucus on January 3rd. New Hampshire had theirs. They had a primary on January 10th, January 21st, January 31st, different states. Some of them are combined into one big day. But starting in January, going through June 26th, all 50 states plus the territories will hold their primary. And then when it's all said and done, we know who the candidate for president will be. Now, technically, if you win a primary, you get delegates. Notice these numbers right here. So if you win Iowa, you'll get some of these delegates. Whoever gets first place gets some of them. Whoever gets second place gets a smaller amount, and so on. And you need to have a certain amount of delegates to win. That's what it's supposed to be. But what really happens is the candidate who starts winning, if some candidates start losing, they just drop out of the race. And then before the primaries are done, before we get to June, usually when we're in March or April, we only have one candidate left. So the primaries then just become a formality. Now let me show you this in the last presidential election. In the 2012 election, the Republicans had a number of people that wanted to be the candidate for the Republican Party. Mitch Romney won that nomination. We know that. Now, he lost to Barack Obama in the election, but he won the Republican nomination. You may or may not remember that these people also ran. Tim Pawlenty, but he dropped out of the race in August before even the first primary. Same thing with McCotter, dropped out before the first primary. Herman Cain dropped out before the first primary. So did Gary Johnson. Michelle Bachmann dropped out after the Iowa caucuses, after the very first one. She only got 5% of the vote in that particular one, and she decided to drop out of the race at that point. John Huntsman dropped out in January, and so did Rick Perry. Rick Santorum dropped out in April, and so did Newt Gingrich. And after April was done, we still had May and June left. Really, there was only one candidate left. Now, that's not completely true because Ron Paul stayed in, but he was wasn't getting enough delegates to, I guess, win the nomination anyway. So we really knew on April 25th who would be the Republican candidate for president, even though there was a number of primaries and caucuses left. On the Democratic side, nobody challenged President Obama when he was running for re-election. But in 2008, you may remember that Barack Obama won the nomination, but Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Chris Dodd and John Edwards and Mike Gravel and Kucinich and Richardson all were running for that spot too. All of them dropped out, and it left just Barack Obama left. And that's usually what happens. The candidates drop out until there's only one remaining. And then when there's one remaining, even if all this isn't done, we know who the candidate will be. After the last primary, there's a little bit of gap in here. In that gap time, candidates are choosing, one thing they'll do is choose their vice presidential candidate. And they'll also raise money, and now we see more campaigning going on there. Eventually, we'll get to the conventions. Now, the convention always happens in the late summer of a presidential election year. And a convention is similar to, well, like a big pep rally, really. It's for about 4 days. The candidate and a bunch of party members will get together along with other party leaders, and they'll give speeches. They'll have music playing. It'll be kind of like rallying the troops. But there are two major things that get accomplished. One is they write their platform. Now, the platform is what the Republicans and Democrats stand for. If you want to know what the Democrats believe when it comes to the environment or jobs or, really anything in society, read their platform. Same with the Republicans. It's what the party believes in, an assortment of all issues. And every 4 years, the parties write their platform. And those platforms may not change much over the 4 years, but there may be some shifts in the platform. Either way, it's a good way to find out what the party actually believes in. And those platforms are written at the convention. The other thing that's kind of important is the party officially nominates their candidate for president. Prior to this, we knew that Barack Obama was going to be the Democratic candidate, but it wasn't official until they're actually nominated at the convention. Okay, so it's kind of a formality, but it's still a reality. Conventions are always held in the late summer of presidential election year. Okay, now, those things, primaries and then conventions, those are roles that parties play in elections. They choose the candidates, and then they're going to help them get elected. And we'll look into what else parties do throughout this particular year.